Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to today's conference on communication ethics. Hi, Emily.
Hello.
I'm Bettina McCulloch-Drake, and I am a second-year student with the Master of Arts in Professional Communication program. Before I introduce our guest speaker, Emily Kennedy, Emily, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and ceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that we call home, or that call this land home. Blah, blah. Working and living on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Our speaker, Dr. Emily Kennedy, is an associate professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia. Her research interests bring together environmental sociology and the sociology of consumers and consumption. This research interrogates how individuals, groups, and communities seek to effect positive changes to the natural environment. Dr. Kennedy will provide a 30-minute presentation followed by a short answer and question period. It's kindly asked that you use the chat function to pose your questions. Thank you. Now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Kennedy as she gives her presentation on equity and environmental beliefs. Over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Bettina. And hi, everybody. I'm just going to check that my slides are visible. Bettina, if you could just...
Yes, you're good.
Yes. Okay, great. All right. I was tasked with speaking about equity and environmental beliefs. Sort of within that broad umbrella category, I'm going to talk about my recent book called Ecotypes: 5 Ways of Caring About the Environment. I'm going to start out by talking about what Ecotypes advances in terms of our understanding of human-environment relationships, why I think it matters for understanding and explaining and also tackling affective polarization. And I'm hoping to do this to be able to incite and invite discussions among each of you about how we might more productively engage Canadians in conversations about climate change. This is might seem like a strange way to start off, and it's a bit odd not being able to see any of you, but I'd like to ask you to, if you're comfortable, close your eyes, and I'll do it too, so it's not too weird, and just sort of picture what comes up when I say environment. What do you picture? What do you feel? And I won't ask anyone to share, but this is one of the questions that I asked 63 people that I interviewed in Washington State in 2015 and 2016 in order to better understand what people's relationship to the environment looks like and feels like, what it means to them. And this was sort of really motivated by my sense that while it makes sense for us as a society to disagree about many things, it makes sense that we disagree about religion. It makes sense that we disagree about education. It doesn't make sense to me that we are not all on the same page about the importance of environmental protection. So I really wanted to understand this at the most micro level possible. What I heard when people answered this question led me to really challenge 2 of the very dominant frameworks. I was tasked with putting this presentation into a 30-minute time slot, so I'm going to really just briefly explain these sort of two alternative frameworks to explaining human-environment relationships. Many of you are probably familiar with these. The first is the idea of sort of values, and that we can understand variation in people's relationship to the environment by asking them about their values. What do people care about? Values, of course, are these like overarching, orienting principles that are supposed to help predict more like visible and immediate things like our attitudes and our behaviors. The argument goes that some people value the environment, some people value themselves, some people value other people. The other framework that's very popular is comes from the Yale program on climate change communication, which is really sort of categorizing people in terms of their concern about the issue of climate change. So ranging from disengaged to alarmed, and sort of explaining human-environment relationships that way. A relationship, of course, involves more than one entity. And my problem with the environmental values framework, as I heard my participants answer that question, is that it seemed to really invisibilize the environment itself. The environment didn't have any qualities. The qualities that were varying were the qualities of the people. And so that, for me, didn't feel like a satisfying description of a relationship. On the other hand, the Yale program on climate change communication seems to invisibilize the human part of that relationship. It involves this sort of really wide-ranging spectrum of concern for the environment itself, but doesn't bring any qualities of the person that comes to bear on that relationship. So the ecotypes framework tries to bring in qualities of the environment, qualities of people, in a way that reflects how my participants answered that question about what they picture when they picture the environment. So perhaps for those of you who join me in that maybe somewhat awkward exercise, you could picture something really clear. I don't need to know what it was, but maybe that image that came to mind, maybe it also came up with a feeling. Maybe it was a feeling of gratitude. Maybe it was a feeling of fear or sadness. But when I talk about like affinity, which I see is really like the centerpiece of this human environment relationship, I really am talking about the intensity of a person's relationship with the environment. Of course, that intensity is shaped by qualities of the environment and also qualities of the person who is in this relationship. Like the program on climate change would predict, what I found was most salient for shaping people's relationship to the environment at the time and place of my interviews was this sense of how dire the ecological crisis is. And that ranged from people who were not particularly concerned to people who, like would cry and express a great deal of distress and grief. But the qualities of the person themselves also matters. What I heard people talking about when they were describing their relationship to the environment was a great deal of variation in the moral commitments that that person felt they owed. A relationship, of course, is one of both rights and responsibilities. And the sort of moral commitments that a person themselves felt that they had to the environment was something that varied in both intensity and quality. And then importantly, so too did the degree to which the person actually felt capable of acting on their moral commitments, this quality of efficacy. Those 4 dimensions gave rise to 5 ecotypes. I'm going to describe them. If you look at this image on the left, I'm going to describe them from the bottom to the top. The eco-engaged are those who feel very strongly that we each need to do our part to protect the environment. They are supportive of government policy. They're very confident that they have a powerful theory of how change should unfold. And they're confident that they are doing what they can to make sure that happens. The self-effacing would agree very strongly with the sort of impulses of the eco-engaged, but they would give themselves a failing grade on their relationship with the environment. They really don't feel like they do enough to sort of feel proud about how they relate to the environment. The fatalists, moving in order here, actually doubt the relevance of individual action altogether. They understand environmental issues as being the result of corporate greed and government passivity, and a sort of a government's lack of courage to be able to rein in corporations. They don't have a great deal of faith that humanity will address the environmental crisis. The optimists doubt the crisis framing altogether. They, like the eco-engaged, are very confident about their relationship with the environment, and they know the environment very intimately. When I would ask them to close their eyes and tell me what they would picture very specific places, streams where they went fishing, forests where they went camping. They knew species that were there. They had a very strong faith that any issue that would come up would be one that humans could respond to. And that faith was rooted not only in sort of faith in human ingenuity, but much more significantly, faith in resilience of the environment itself. And then finally, the indifferent were the group that, if I sort of said, what do you picture when you picture the environment, would say, like, I don't know, green things. They had other priorities, and they tended to equate environmental concern, like how concerned are you about the environment, with efficacy. So they would say, I don't even feel capable of answering that question. I think that these ecotypes can help us understand the way in which we are polarized over issues like climate change. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. I'm going to come at this from maybe a surprising direction. But one of the reasons why I think that we are polarized over the environment is I think that is because we have a status hierarchy that is shaped by our relationships to the environment. And it's a status hierarchy that not everyone in that hierarchy accepts or assents to. I suggest that we have this hierarchy where eco-engaged are at the top. And I'll talk about this on the next slide. But first, I'm just going to sort of talk about the rise of this hierarchy. We can sort of contrast a hierarchy to a heterarchy. A heterarchy would be a situation where you could imagine multiple relationships or affinities existing and not any one of them being no better or worse than anything else. I actually feel like a reasonable example of this would be like sports fans. So, you know, whether you're like Team Oilers or Canucks or, I don't know, Leafs, God help you. There's not necessarily a hierarchy that is a universally accepted hierarchy. Of course, for Oilers fans, there's a hierarchy, but that doesn't mean that that's sort of something where you are going to be belittled or disrespected or dehumanized in society if you are a Canucks fan. What I think we have with the environment is this emergence of a hierarchy where some relationships to the environment end up in that sort of dehumanizing and disrespect. And I think that partly this can be attributed to the rise of what are called lifestyle movements that have happened over the last 30 years. So whereas the environmental movement was really a movement focused on protest and policy gains in the 1970s, really post 1992 in the Rio Convention, the environmental movement became a movement that encouraged things like individual ecological footprint analysis and household engagement in recycling. And that really gave rise to this emergence of a proliferation of eco-friendly market options, whether that was in food or in clothing or in vehicles or in really any domain of sort of like household practice. We saw all of these market options. As these options emerged, I argue that so too did this tendency to moralize consumer-based environmental behaviors. So it didn't matter if, like, whether you're, all of a sudden, it matters if you're the sort of person who is a vegan versus someone who's going to buy meat from an unknown industrial source, that choice to purchase or consume something is now all of a sudden communicating something about your moral worth. That moralization has been integrated really broadly into all sorts of cultural media. I encounter it when I read novels, watching films, television shows. In the book, I start one of the chapters with the television show The Good Place. And for those of you who haven't seen it, bit of a spoiler alert, but it is sort of centered on this idea that nobody has ended up in the good place after their death in like 500 years, because every single individual's consumer choices are unwittingly tied to ecological and social justice atrocities. So we really see this coming up in a wide range of cultural media, and also increasingly in academia, whether that's in our classrooms or in our articles, where ultimately it is sort of saying there are good relationships to the environment and there are bad relationships to the environment. And the variation in those is a function of the individual's moral worth. Any sort of new status hierarchy, whether it's based on wealth or based on gender or based on ability, a hierarchy is going to create winners and losers. And what we know from sociological research on power is that the winners in a hierarchy tend to be given the authority to write the rules that keep them winning. The losers, or sort of, I mean, that's putting it a bit bluntly, but the people who are at the bottom of a status hierarchy are really forced to choose between two, I would say, equally crappy options. They can assent to the logic of the hierarchy, or they can challenge the hierarchy. And before I get into that in more detail, I'm going to talk about the hierarchy itself. So I talked about those 5 ecotypes, and what I am arguing is that there is this cultural idea of an ideal environmentalist, and that the eco-engaged both shape how we understand what an ideal environmentalist is and reflect that ideal themselves. This is not only the quintessential eco-friendly shopper, it's also the sort of quintessential highly concerned climate leader. So I really want us to avoid thinking in terms of good and bad here, and instead really try to evoke sort of your empathy and curiosity and understand why it makes sense for each of these ecotypes to have the relationship to the environment that they do. I conducted my research in 2015 and 2016, but I would say that the eco-engaged of today in my current time and place is also the type of person who sees environmental issues and justice issues as intimately tied and unable to be separated. So increasingly, I think the eco-engaged are also those who are pursuing social justice and environmental justice. The self-effacing, of course, are this group that supports what the eco-engaged support, but they don't feel that they are worthy. And so they assent to being in a less privileged position in this hierarchy because they believe in the virtue of the hierarchy. The fatalists and the indifferent, I would sort of characterize as resistant environmentalists. They see powerful actors and institutions as responsible, or they just feel powerless, and they have kind of checked out. They also assent to their position in the hierarchy, and they have no aspiration that they will one day be ideal environmentalists. They're not sort of envisioning this upward mobility. The literature would refer to optimists as anti-environmentalists, and I deliberately put that in scare quotes because I think that's a fundamentally insulting and inaccurate portrayal of the optimists who I interviewed. The optimists are the only ecotype that actively challenge the logic of the hierarchy. They resent the cultural hegemony that the ideal environmentalist has, and they themselves really desire recognition for their relationship to the environment. So now I'm going to return to that idea that when you're in a lower position in a hierarchy, you have two choices. This, what I'm presenting on this slide, on the theory side, is drawn directly from the researcher Cecilia Ridgway, who has spent her entire career understanding status. And one of the questions that she asked was why people at the bottom of a hierarchy would ascend to that position. And her answer is that because doing so, assenting to the logic of a hierarchy, means that the group, including those at the top and those at the bottom, evaluate you as being a reasonable person, and therefore you are granted respect. This argument is really premised in the idea that ultimately most of us are seeking connection, and a feeling of sort of safety and security comes from feeling connected and accepted by our group. And so this would suggest that when people who, like the indifferent, the fatalists, and the self-effacing, assent to not being at the top of the hierarchy, in part that's because that is a safe decision for them. I saw this really show up in my data. I saw it show up in the way that both the eco-engaged and also the self-effacing would express visceral dislike and distrust of people like the optimists in particular. They would use terms like ignorant, selfish, disgusting, and unethical to refer to people who they thought had a bad relationship with the environment. So that would be, say, people who drove trucks, people who enjoyed ATVing, people who were skeptical of climate change. These are also terms in the literature that are commonly used to justify or normalize the idea of someone deserving low status. On the other hand, when I talk to the optimists and ask them their evaluations of people like the eco-engaged, they use terms like smug, self-righteous, and hypocritical. In the literature, these terms are commonly used to challenge a person's sort of elevated position in a status hierarchy. I think that we see this affective polarization quite acutely in Canada, and I think that this is a topic for another day. It's really unnecessary. But I will get to that, I don't know, years from now. But I collected these convenience, so it's data from a convenience sample, so it's not a representative sample, but I collected data from just over 1,000 Canadians just a few months ago, asking about the extent to which people who support decarbonization like and trust those who oppose decarbonization, and asking those who oppose decarbonization the extent to which they like and trust people who support decarbonization. And what you can see in this chart here is that those who support decarbonization feel very warmly toward other people who support decarbonization. That's the sort of about the level 8 here. I think you should be able to see my cursor. Opponents of decarbonization also like and trust other opponents of decarbonization, but that like and trust is not as high, and this is statistically significantly different compared to supporters. What is, I think, more interesting is that supporters of decarbonization dislike and distrust opponents significantly more than opponents of decarbonization dislike and distrust supporters of decarbonization. And I think that part of the intensity that we see with the supporters comes from this elevated position in the status hierarchy and a very strong sense that they are right. I'm not going to get into the material argument about right and wrong right now, although I'm happy to talk about that. This research is really motivated by the belief that as a society, we stand a much better chance of actually doing something significant about climate change if we have a united civil society. And this image does not show a united civil society. So just to sort of draw all the pieces together, the theory of polarization that I'm putting forward is, first of all, that we do have a very widespread consensus that environmental protection is morally good. That said, there are a range of views that exist on how we as a society should pursue environmental protection. These views are increasingly organized hierarchically and associated with different levels of status and also moral worth. High status are the eco-engaged. Eco-engaged, in terms of like a follow-up survey that I conducted after my interviews, are most likely to be politically liberal, and they're most likely to have a high level of socioeconomic privilege. Lower status relationships to the environment tend to be ecotypes that are much more likely to exist among political conservatives. Optimists tend to be relatively privileged, socioeconomically privileged conservatives, whereas fatalists and indifferent tend to be working class conservatives. Just for those who are interested, the self-effacing tend to be less politically liberal, but with less socioeconomic privilege than the eco-engaged. We see this status hierarchy really expressed through emotion, the way in which the eco-engaged express pride about their relationship with the environment. The self-effacing conveyed a sense of guilt, again, this sort of acquiescence to a lower position in the hierarchy. The fatalists and the indifferent expressed resignation, again, an acceptance of a lower position in the hierarchy. And the optimists expressed anger, a position of unjustified low status in the hierarchy. These emotions then signal the degree to which an ecotype enjoys privilege and the acceptance of their ecotype in sort of the cultural mainstream, and results in polarization when people who oppose climate action are also then seen as challenging a status hierarchy. Opposing climate action in any way, shape, or form means that they are not only not granted respect, but also dehumanized. So how then can we use this information to have more productive conversations about climate change? To first just put it bluntly, I don't think there is any communication that is going to engage the disengaged, as the Yale program on climate change would put it, if we don't confront this status hierarchy. It's just going to feel like white noise, because the message is going to be really distracted by the messenger. So what are our options? Our options are, I believe, to accept the hierarchy that I put forward. But if we're going to accept the hierarchy, we also have to create the conditions for mobility. That means that everybody should be able to have an equal opportunity, whether that's in terms of like geographic proximity, access to like subsidies, wealth equality, et cetera, to be able to engage in this like eco-engaged lifestyle. Or what I think is the more culturally significant choice, we can try to challenge the hierarchy. And that is going to require a cultural shift as opposed to a shift of policy and materials, trying to shift to a heterarchy by, I think, cultivating respect for multiple ecotypes. That doesn't mean that you have to believe that another ecotype is good or better than yours, but just that you have to understand why another ecotype makes sense for another group of people and accept that. So how do we create a heterarchy? The content on the left is really how we create a hierarchy, and then the content in green is how we would shift to creating a heterarchy. So when we make character judgments of someone, based on their relationship to the environment, we're placing blame on individuals. We're sort of assuming that an individual chooses, like actively chooses their perspective on their orientation to the environment, as opposed to understanding that there are a wide range of social structures in that person's biography and current social context that shapes their relationship to the environment. So a heterarchy would come from encouraging perspective taking instead of judgment. As I alluded to, this sort of individualization, it really ignores the role of social structures, whereas we can create a hierarchy, when we consider biography and social context. Ultimately, when we ignore the role of social structures, we're obscuring the involvement of powerful actors. Whereas with this approach to shift to a heterarchy, we're starting to think really critically about the actors and the institutions who benefit not only from divisiveness and polarization in society, but who also benefit from a theory of environmental change that is rooted in the idea that individuals need to engage more ethically in the marketplace. Ultimately, a hierarchy divides civil society, whereas a heterarchy invites the capacity for society to create common goals, not only create, but identify the common goals that already exist. The hierarchy, I argue, is driving polarization. And in a hierarchical society, we can see diverse viewpoints as healthy. I think that this is the challenge that really lays before us, but I end on this slide because this is what I picture when I close my eyes and picture the environment. And as cliche as it sounds, I really derive hope from my many experiences encountering all sorts of people when I am in the forest. I think that the environment is this incredible common good that we all value and respect. And we can derive a lot of, I think, productive conversation as a society from remembering this. Before I officially wrap up, I just want to thank the participants. I was just knocking on people's doors and asking if they would participate in an interview, and then sending people surveys and asking them to complete it. It's it's such a generous thing for people to share their views and their thoughts, and I really appreciate that. And I got lots of funding to support this research, so thank you to the money people and to my talented and delightful research assistants who helped along the way, and also to Jessica Van Honder from Reclimate for the slide design. And that is it for me.
Perfect, Emily. Thank you. You don't see me on camera, but I have some questions from our lovely attendees today. The first question, of course, some of the questions are kind of like they have a little bit of preamble, so I'll read the preamble because that will help provide context. The first question is from Linda Quintera. She says, I'm curious to know how this framework fits with the Indigenous perspectives on environment. Though it feels like Indigenous knowledge might fit into optimism, the term optimist feels very judgy, Western, where there is an assumption that optimism is something we choose or identify with. How might an Indigenous mythology ask these same questions and sift through these variants of eco-consciousness?
Yeah, this is a really wonderful question. I think Linda was the name of the question asker. It's also, I would say, the question that I am asked most often. So I can't really speak to it from my data because my sample was a deliberately general population sample. But I do want to acknowledge that there are so many Indigenous perspectives on environmentalism. I am not Indigenous, so I am not going to start saying what those are. But I've really enjoyed reading the work of many Indigenous scholars and have appreciated the diversity that exists in Indigenous relationships to the environment and Indigenous perspectives on the environment. I often heard my participants call up Indigenous perspectives to the environment as sort of like this, not this sort of like space of purity, but there was a way in which that conjuring up of this mythical Indigenous perspective, and with, you know, capital I, capital P, felt very, it felt like a form of erasure in a strange sense to me. It sort of felt like it was putting this Indigenous relationship to the environment in the past and not necessarily acknowledging the way in which Indigenous people in the present are engaging in a wide range of relationships to the environment. That said, I think that among the eco-engaged these days, there is a very strong sense that we need to draw on Indigenous perspectives to the environment. And while I think, of course, there is wisdom in that, there's also a degree to which I worry about that being essentializing, sort of like creating this one idea of an Indigenous perspective. And I also worry about it further narrowing the scope of who can participate in environmentalism, as also meaning not only do you have to care about the environment, but you also have to be on the same page about the importance of Indigenous perspectives. And I don't think, I come at this from the perspective that we need fewer barriers to entry to environmentalism rather than more barriers to entry.
Perfect. Thank you for the answer. We have a few more questions. We have time for those. The next question is from Kyle Mallinson. The question reads, how do you feel about rebranding environmentalism to appeal to people with polarized views against it? Can it be done without diluting the message, and should it?
So if I understand the question correctly, it's saying that if we are taking the concept of environmentalism and diluting it to avoid polarization, that in and of itself might have harmful consequences. I think that, I hope I understand the question correctly, Kyle. My sense from the perspective of like this status research, and I apologize for bluntness, but I feel like bluntness is more helpful than vagueness. But I think that in some ways comes from a position of being at the top of a status hierarchy. In some ways, there is this counterfactual universe where the ideal relationship to the environment is one where people don't think about the climate and they enjoy ATVing and fishing. And I don't think that the idea of environmentalism as being this very strict homology of beliefs has served us very well. I think it possibly could if we were in a dictatorship, but I think in a democratic society, environmentalism needs to make sense and resonate with everybody. There isn't an advantage, I don't think, to having it being, I guess the opposite of diluted would be like pure. And I don't think that there's an advantage to having sort of like a pure environmentalism at a time when I believe that what we need is more like broad buy-in to environmentalism. One of the reasons that why in the book, I also asked people questions to be able to estimate their carbon footprint. And one of the reasons why I did this was because in my interviews, I just noticed the way in which the eco-engaged counted the things that they did for the environment, like having a reusable water bottle or buying organic or having solar panels, but didn't count things like flying a lot and traveling a lot and having large homes and multiple homes. And that really showed up in my data analysis too. The eco-engaged had the largest carbon footprint by far. And I don't say that to say that I actually don't think carbon footprint is a useful measure. I think it's a bit silly, but I do think that it's a useful argument to point out that there is not a material benefit that I can see to this very strict definition of environmentalism. It's a really thoughtful question, though, and I'll keep thinking about it.
Okay, thanks for trying to get through that question. I may reattack with another comment or question that Kyle put in. But in the meantime, we're going to go to a question from Cheryl. I'm sorry for the pronunciation of the last name, Wenezensky Yoland. And her question comment is, in considering this discussion of hierarchy and polarization, it causes me to pause and consider this type of labeling and classification of people is helpful in drawing people together to achieve a better future. Thoughts on this? Question mark.
Could you repeat the question? I'm not totally sure I understand it.
Yeah. I think the question is the wondering or perhaps getting more clarification on the type of labeling and classification of people and whether or not that's helpful for drawing people together to achieve a better future. I think that's the question. But Cheryl, feel free to clarify in the chat at any time.
So the idea of the ecotypes framework is really the framework itself. So affinity, morality, severity, and efficacy. And so the point about the ecotypes, whether it's eco-engaged, self-effacing, my sort of the way in which I would hope that that would shape and tackle polarization isn't by saying like, oh, you over here, you're an eco-engaged. Why don't you sit down with a fatalist? And I don't think that there's anything particularly productive in those labels. For me, it was a way to depict that there are sort of different modalities of orienting to the environment based on variation in affinity, severity, morality, and efficacy. I do think that there is a great deal of value to identifying that, if you perceive your moral responsibility to be one way and you encounter someone who seems to have a different sense of their moral responsibility, I think it's very worthwhile to understand where that person is coming from and to sort of approach those different ecotypes from a place of curiosity and empathy, really aiming for perspective taking. Because what I encounter in my own experience in environmental activism is that often we pick up on different ecotypes already, and we respond to them with a great deal of judgment and sort of like preconceived ideas. Yeah.
Great. This is the last question given the time. The question is from Jeff Blanchard. So the preamble and the question is, with the role that government and policymakers have in environmental issues, is there a strategy you would recommend for program delivery that is less forceful or better positioned to reduce polarization? I ask this in the context of all of the mandated government initiatives that has created a polarization to any government mandates.
Yeah, so this is really the centerpiece of my next project, which hasn't really started yet. So I don't have anything concrete to answer, but my sense is that that government policy, whether that's at the municipal, provincial, federal level, will be more effective at effective in terms of having buy-in from citizens if it is as inductive as possible. So I think, in some ways this is like old school, like deliberative democracy, kind of organizing, but I think understanding from people themselves what their concerns and sort of like pressure points are, and building policy that reflects best evidence from experts, but that also moves forward in a way that best reflects the culture of the people whose livelihoods it's going to impact. That's a very vague answer, and it's a real just like, ask me in a couple of years when I've completed the next phase of this research project. So sorry for punting that one down the road.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for answering the questions. Very much for the presentation, greatly appreciate it. So to everyone who attended, thank you for attending. Feel free to stick around. The next presentation, entitled Tabby Poe, Ethics of Relations in Performing Ecology and Communicating, Community Building, will begin at 11 a.m. Pacific time. Again, just a reminder, if you are interested in our programs, feel free to check the chat. And Emily, thank you again for everything. I look forward to, and I'm sure a lot of other people look forward to your research. A link to Emily's website that includes some of her research will be provided in the chat for anyone interested. So I'm going to be putting that in the chat right now. So feel free to check out Emily's research, and I hope everyone sticks around. If not, have a great day.
Bye, everyone.